Hi, everyone, and welcome to the 31st edition of Stay at Home. And my name is Bhaskar Sankar. I'm the editor and publisher at Jacobin. Almost every day at around 6 p.m., I've been joined by a left-wing thinker these past few weeks. And we've been hearing 30-minute lectures, roughly 30-minute lectures, on a topic and doing a brief Q&A afterwards. This is a project that we're trying to encourage people to get involved, asking the questions. So please log in to the YouTube chat and submit your questions while our guest is speaking. And this is a project we've been doing on a pure kind of non-monetary basis. We haven't been setting up a Patreon or doing a super chat or asking people to give us money in any way for these. It's available for free. It will remain archived and available for free. So our big ask and our appeal every single night, if you are watching these regularly, you're probably getting sick of hearing me saying this, but please press like and press subscribe. And we ask that not just for our vanity, but because it allows us to reach more people with these videos. It kind of helps along the YouTube algorithm. And this week, we have a lot of really great material. Tomorrow, we have a chat with Marcus Barnett, who's one of the editors at Tribune, our sister publication in the UK. And Marcus will be talking, along with Tribune editor Ronan Burtonshaw, about the socialism of Tony Benn and the labor left as a whole. So Benn is a really interesting figure. He moved from kind of the center left of the party to the hard left of the party over the course of his career. What's really interesting about Benn is that he was radicalized not outside of government, but in government when he was a cabinet member in the Wilson and I guess the Callahan administration after that. He saw the pressures that capital put on a pro-worker government. He saw the concessions and retreats of social democracy, and he pushed for an alternative to the growing trends of monetarism in the UK. And obviously he fell short, but Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell and the rest of the Labour left is really indebted to Benn, as is Marcus. So I'm really looking forward to that tomorrow. Then on Friday, we have an unusual sort of format. It'll just be a more free-flowing conversation between Jacobin's Connor Kilpatrick, Chapo Trap House Matt Christman, and they're going to talk for a bit on Friday to celebrate May Day with Jacobin. Then on Saturday, we have another edition of Weekends with Anna Kasparian and Michael Brooks. The guest on Saturday is Ryan Grimm from The Intercept. So that's what we have lined up. Again, if you add it all up, we're probably doing maybe 10 hours of content almost per week, and it's all for free. So press like, press subscribe, tell your friends about it. Tonight, I'm joined by a longtime collaborator of mine. I joined the editorial board of New Politics when I was in my late teens, and Adaner was one of two young members. I don't even mean young in the kind of like, oh, if you're not under 25, you're not young way. I meant, one of the two people under the age of like 45 or 50 on the New Politics board. And Adaner Usmani is today, he really made it a long way from the New Politics board. He's a professor at Harvard University, and he's also a Catalyst board member. And I'm sure that's the achievement that he, tells his mom and dad about. But he's, beyond kind of editing and contributing to the process of Catalyst. He's recently written an article with John Clegg called The Economic Roots or the Economic Origins of Mass Incarceration in a recent edition of Catalyst. By the way, that's unpaywalled, so you should check it out and read it today. And also, Adaner did a long-form interview with Jacobin that encapsulates some of the key arguments of the article and also kind of goes into a few new directions as well. So today, he's going to be talking with us about that topic, about the roots of mass incarceration, about how a socialist should think about its origins, then therefore, what are some of the conclusions we should draw about how to actually end it? What type of politics it will take to end it? So I'm looking forward to this topic. Again, while Adaner is speaking, if any questions come up, just put it in the YouTube chat. I'll try to get to them. Adaner's going to talk for a little bit longer than usual today. He'll be talking for maybe 40, 45 minutes. So we're going to have a shorter Q&A. So please do put your questions in. I'll try to get to as many as possible, but we'll be done here in an hour total. But thanks a lot, Adaner, and go ahead.
Thanks, Bhaskar. Thanks for having me. So let me begin by stating the obvious about American mass incarceration, which is that it's a epoch-defining injustice, right? The carceral state is barbaric. The fact that we live in one of the richest countries in world history, and yet millions of people are behind bars, to say nothing of brutal policing and those caught up in the broader dragnet of the state. These facts are outrageous, barbaric. They're a blot on American civilization. And so it is long overdue for major fundamental reform. That's why I study it. That's why I write about it. That's no doubt why you are listening to this talk. But to invert His Highness Karl Marx, if we want to change the world, we must interpret it correctly first. We have to understand mass incarceration if we want to dismantle it. And so in that spirit, I'd like to do 4 things today in this talk. First, in a little bit more detail, I want to say a little bit more about what it means to study mass incarceration as a sociological problem. What does it mean when we're saying we want to try and understand mass incarceration? I'm going to say to you that to understand mass incarceration is to answer 3 puzzles about American punishment. What changed in the United States in the 1970s? What makes America so exceptional relative to other developed countries? And why is American punishment so unequally stratified across the American population? And today I'm going to speak specifically about racial inequality in punishment. The second thing I'd like to do is, after having outlined what it is that we need to understand about American punishment, I want to say a little bit about how it's misunderstood. I'm going to outline some misconceptions that commonly circulate about American mass incarceration, especially, but not just on the left. Third, having dismissed those misconceptions and kind of using that dismissal as an opportunity to establish some facts of my own, I'm going to offer you my own account of mass incarceration in those 3 puzzles. And you can find the longer, sort of fuller version of this in the Catalyst essay that John Clegg and I wrote, which Bhaskar alluded to. But I'm here going to try and summarize it. What changed in the United States, why the United States, and why racial inequality in punishment. And then finally, the 4th thing that I want to do today is, after having offered you this analysis, I want to say what follows from it, in my view, about criminal justice reform for criminal justice reformers and for socialists. So what should you, as socialists or socialist curious YouTubers, keep in mind when thinking about criminal justice reform, when plotting course for future horizons, when planning campaigns? How should we think about criminal justice reform? I want to spend a little bit of time talking about that as well. So first, let me say a little bit, as I was suggesting, about what mass incarceration is. I propose, as I said already, that you think about it as 3 puzzles about American punishment. The first is a longitudinal puzzle, a puzzle about the rate of incarceration over time in the United States. Why is American punishment today so different than it was before? So in the early to mid 20th century, we know that America incarcerated around 150 people per 100,000. For reference, this is roughly the rate at which today developed countries incarcerate their populations. In the 1970s, though, something very dramatic changed, and the incarceration rate quintupled, roughly. That incarceration rate, the incarceration rate that we're living through now, that there's a respectable academic debate about whether that incarceration rate is higher or lower than the incarceration rate under Stalin's Soviet Union, right? So it's a world historic kind of regime that we're living through. So what changed? That's the first puzzle. The second puzzle relates to this fact that I've just shared, which is a cross-national puzzle about the United States. What explains why America is so different from other countries? So the graph that you can see on your screen right now is requires a little bit of explanation, but basically the width of the blobs that you see corresponds to the number of countries that incarcerate at a given level. So you can see that most developed countries incarcerate around 100 per 100,000, as I was saying. And even in the developing world, roughly that's more or less the median. There's some greater variation. There's Russia, there's Cuba, whatever. But the United States, as you can see, is a massive outlier. Today, it incarcerates more of its population than any country in the world. And that is something also that we need to try and understand. And then finally, there's a very well-known cross-sectional puzzle about the distribution of punishment across the American population. There are many, many different ways to show this, but the graph that I chose to show shows the disparity in incarceration for men born in the late 1970s. And you can see that it's a roughly 5-to-1, 6-to-1 disparity, which is basically what the racial disparity has been for most of the period of American incarceration. So these are the three puzzles that we need to try and understand when we say we want to explain what American mass incarceration is. So the second thing, having outlined this puzzle, let me say something about common misconceptions that circulate about American mass incarceration and efforts to answer these puzzles. I'm going to speak specifically about 7 different misconceptions. The first of these is you will often hear people argue that trends in incarceration bear basically no relationship to trends in crime. They're uncorrelated. To prove this point, you'll often see a graph which shows the incarceration rate and the crime rate plotted from 1990 to the present. And if you do this, if you see this graph, you are very likely to correctly maybe infer that there's no correlation, because these two things look like trends passing in the night. But there are at least 2 big mistakes with inferring that crime is unrelated to incarceration based just on this graph. The first is that, as you can see, the graph starts in 1990, which is very, very misleading. If you start the graph earlier, in the 1960s, it looks different. The picture looks different. And in fact, what you see is that our best indicators of violent crime rose quite dramatically in the 1960s and the 1970s. Here, I think you, in the graph, see the violent crime rate. Something similar is true of the homicide rate, which is more accurately measured, right? It rose quite dramatically in the United States, and soon after, the incarceration rate began to increase as well. So expanding the frame yields a slightly different picture. The second point here is that comparing the incarceration rate to the crime rate is actually a comparison of apples to oranges, because the incarceration rate measures both past and present incarcerations, while the crime rate is a measure of present crime in a given year. So if you instead plot the change in the incarceration rate, there is a much more obvious relationship between the two, and that's more of an oranges to oranges comparison. So none of this, I want to be very clear, is to argue that the rate of crime simply mechanically determines the rate of incarceration. Lots of other things do figure. But what I want to convince you of is that people are wrong to argue that there's no relationship between these two things at all. And in fact, what I'm going to argue to you as I proceed today is that the rise in violence, the rise in crime, was a necessary condition for the rise in punishment, even if not a sufficient condition. And I'll explain a little bit more what I mean by that as we go along. The second misconception is the argument that people's fear of crime in the United States is simply manufactured, right? You'll often hear the argument that the public was putty in the hands of politicians. They were taught to panic about crime by politicians or the media. Conventionally, this story about American mass incarceration and the public panic goes something like this, right? In the 1970s and the 1980s, people began to panic about crime because politicians sort of told them to, or manufactured their panic. Particularly, the story is that Southern politicians saw political opportunity in the South after the success of the civil rights movement and the challenge to the established racial order to win disaffected white Democrats by using the rhetoric of law and order. And it's this that's conventionally argued that explains the rise in public fear over the 60s and the 70s. This is the argument made famous by The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, which is a book that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and it was my first entry into the subject of mass incarceration. My view is that this argument is mistaken. Let me just focus on two reasons to think this. First, our best data on public fear suggests that it wasn't actually just white Southerners, but everyone, whites in the North and Black Americans in general, who turned punitive and anxious about crime. So you should be able to see this in a graph on your screen that illustrates data from my own research, which tries to estimate aggregate levels of punitiveness over time in the American population. The second thing that's important here is that there is not much evidence really that they did so as a reaction to the civil rights movement. So punitiveness does not seem, if you look at the data, to be an abrupt reaction to events in the late 1960s, but rather more of a gradual reaction which peaked in the 1990s. It ends up being actually very correlated with the violent crime rate and not very correlated, as the graphs suggested, not very correlated with the civil rights movement, which peaks in the late 1960s, or what politicians were saying about the civil rights movement. So that's the second misconception, the idea that public anxiety about crime is simply manufactured. A third misconception is that mass incarceration was built by the few to control the many. Now, it's very common to hear that mass incarceration was constructed with the intention of controlling African Americans or the American poor, or both. Now, I want to be very clear about this because there's no doubt that mass incarceration has this effect. It has the effect of socially controlling the poor and racial minorities. An excellent book among many that illustrates this is a book recently written by Issa Kohler-Hausman called Misdemeanorland. But arguing that mass incarceration in the carceral state has this effect is very, very different from showing that it was built or arguing that it was built with this intention. And there are two major problems with the argument that it was built by a handful of elites with this intention. The first problem is that in these accounts, the key protagonists are presidents, Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, and their federal administrations. But actually, almost all of the relevant policies, all the relevant penal policies were made at the state and local levels, not at the federal level. State and local governments house most of America's prisoners. They spend most of America's money on prisons, and the same is true on police. Now, I don't want to imply that there was no federal inspiration and that federal legislation didn't matter, but mass incarceration is really better understood as a story of 50 states or maybe even 3,000 local county governments moving in the same direction, rather than as a story of one or two figures in America's highest office. That's the first problem. The second problem with the view is the idea that America was built, that mass incarceration was built by elites to control the many is difficult to sustain when you realize that actually one of the atypical features of American criminal justice is not so much the absence of democracy, but the pervasiveness of it. Let me explain what I mean by this, because this might be a surprising point. Unlike other European countries, American electorates actually have a lot of say in criminal justice outcomes. Juries make important decisions, but more than that, really, judges, prosecutors, some police chiefs are elected or at least appointed by elected officials, whereas they're unelected civil servants in other countries. And elected officials in state legislatures have much wider say over criminal justice policy here than is the case in Europe, where it's much more bureaucratic. Lots of academics argue that this kind of exceptionally democratic nature helps explain partly America's exceptionally harsh criminal justice system. Now, I don't endorse that view entirely, but I do think that there's a kernel of truth to the idea that democracy has, in American criminal justice, is a contributing cause to punishment. And I can say more about this in the Q&A, how we should think about this. Probably the most well-received book about why America has the death penalty and other countries don't, other European countries don't, is that America has empowered, the argument is that America has empowered people in criminal justice in these ways. The death penalty actually was popular, according to this book, in Europe, but at the time of its abolition, but political elites had the institutional capacity to ignore popular opinion. This is a book, the book's name is Peculiar Institution, and it's by the sociologist David Garland. So that's the point here, is that the story of mass incarceration is much, much more sobering than a story of conniving, powerful men at the center of American government. A fourth misconception that is very, very common if you have a casual conversation, say, with somebody about why America has gulags, the standard answer, kind of exaggerating a little, will be, well, we've criminalized in Black and brown communities the usage of drugs. And America has a high incarceration rate because of the rate at which it incarcerates its nonviolent, low-level drug offenders. Now, many criminal justice reformers, and maybe some of you, know that this isn't actually true, but I'm still always surprised at how many people believe this when I discuss mass incarceration. So it's worth reiterating why it's wrong. Only about 20 to 25% of the prison and jail population in the United States is in there for drug-related offenses. And so if you were to eliminate drug offenders, the US would still be an international world historic outlier. Moreover, and this is a really important point, of that 20 to 25%, a very, very small minority, perhaps as low as 5%, are the kinds of offenders that are identified by the conventional story. Nonviolent, low-level drug offenders with no ties to the drug trade. Now, this doesn't mean that the rest are kingpins or something like that, not at all. But most people are trapped somewhere in the. Most people are somewhere in the middle, kind of trapped into American prisons as a consequence of being involved in the drug trade. And so, in short, this is not really a story about the war on drugs in the way that it's conventionally told, as a story of locking up people who are guilty of nothing but using a little bit of weed or something like that, right? So the war on drugs story is also a common misconception. A fifth misconception is you'll often hear reformers argue that mass incarceration, it's not just morally abhorrent, the way that I was outlining at the beginning, but it's also ineffective in its stated aims. It doesn't reduce crime. You hear this all the time about police, for instance. Police just make things worse, not better in terms of the crime rate. Now, my reading of the current literature is that this argument is mostly misleading. Our best estimates suggest that both the number of police and the number of prisoners have negative effects on the crime rate. Moreover, a reasonably significant part of the decline in crime in the 1990s and 2000s, definitely not all, but not none, is probably explained by the rise of America's carceral state. Now, I want to be very clear about this. This says nothing at all about whether mass incarceration is justified. If tomorrow you started executing people for double parking, there'd be a lot less double parking. But no one would argue that executions for double parking are somehow justified as a result. And I think similarly about the problem of American mass incarceration, the rise of the carceral state. A sixth misconception is that you'll often hear that the United States spends an enormous amount of money locking up offenders. If we could just put that money towards education, housing, healthcare, and welfare, it would solve all of the problems that prisons can't solve. The statistic you often hear is that we spend $40,000 per prisoner, and we spend much less per person that we send to state university or something like that. Now, the fact about per capita expenditure is right, and that should be illustrated on your screen right now. But the inference that prisons are more expensive on aggregate as a consequence is wrong. And so how can this be? Let me try and explain this. The per capita comparison ends up being misleading because incarceration is not a program for all poor people. It's targeted, in fact, at that very small minority of mostly poor people who end up committing criminal acts. Social programs, on the other hand, are targeted at all people. If not all people, at least all poor people. The result of this is that in the United States, spending on prisons and police is totally dwarfed by spending on social programs. Even in this stingy welfare state that we call home, or at least some of us on this YouTube call home, spending on prisons and police is dwarfed by spending on social programs. We spend in the United States about $250 billion on courts, prisons, and the police. We spend up to 12 times that on social programs. Now, some of this money goes to the middle class in the form of programs that can't be called social spending in any reasonable sense of the term. But even that money that's targeted just at poor people is significantly larger than the amount of money that we spend on prisons and police. The best estimates, for instance, of the money that goes just to means-tested programs is about $1 trillion, or about 4 times the size of the carceral state. And that figure ignores all of the money that goes to universal programs but is spent on the poor. So mass incarceration is really, and this is the point that I'm going to try and hammer repeatedly, mass incarceration is crime control on the cheap. Finally, a seventh misconception is the idea that racial disparities, which are one of the most salient, morally abhorrent features of American punishment, that racial disparities in incarceration are explained by either explicit or implicit bias of police, prosecutors, juries, and judges. Now, here I want to be very clear that there is very good social scientific evidence of differential treatment in the criminal justice system. Similarly situated, Black and white offenders are treated differently. And that should be no surprise to any of us. For instance, federal data from the federal system has shown that Black offenders are sentenced to sentences that are roughly 20 to 25% longer than similarly charged white offenders. But to note that there is this kind of racism, this kind of differential treatment, is not to have shown that the total racial disparity is explained by differential treatment. And this really is the critical point. So let me just work with this example that I gave you. 25% sentence disparity between Black and white similarly situated offenders sounds very large, and in one sense, of course, it is. But remember that we're trying to account, as I showed you at the very beginning, for a 500% disparity, a 5-to-1 disparity. So another way of putting the same two facts would be that racism in sentencing explains only 5% of the total racial disparity in punishment. That's 25 divided by 500. So of course, to be very clear, racism in the sense of differential treatment is not limited to sentencing, arrest, charge, and conviction. Sorry, it's not limited to sentencing. It expands to arrest, charge, conviction. All the stages of the criminal justice process are riddled with this kind of differential treatment. But our best evidence from criminologists suggests that most of the racial disparity in incarceration is not explained by this kind of differential treatment, but rather by the fact that African Americans are overrepresented in the ranks of criminal offenders. About 70 to 75% of rates of this disparity in rates of incarceration can be explained by disparities in crime commission. And this isn't easy to estimate, so I can speak a little bit about the difficulties, the evidentiary difficulties here in the Q&A. But let me just press on, because here I want to be very, very clear about what follows from this. People tend to be wary of this argument because they think that noting these disparities in crime somehow justifies disparities in punishment. But I want to emphasize that this is to commit a basic category mistake, a basic error in reasoning. Observing the fact of racial disparities in offending does not commit you to victim blaming, or much less to supporting mass incarceration. A fact can't yield a judgment. So let me just explain what I mean. To have argued that most of the racial disparity in incarceration is explained by racial disparities in offending is actually just to have raised another question, right? Well, what explains racial disparities in offending? And here there's a very, very long tradition of scholarship inside my discipline of sociology, but broadly in the social sciences, that offers a good answer. African Americans are more likely to be involved in violence because they live in America's worst, most segregated neighborhoods at the bottom of its class structure and with few opportunities to escape. So crime, high rates of crime, they're an index of oppression. Now, if you accept this argument, if you can agree with me that high rates of crime in certain communities are in fact due to racial inequality in life circumstances, it's very, very difficult, even preposterous, to hold people or racial groups to blame in the way that victim blamers would like. And it's even more difficult to go one step further and argue that somehow racial disparities are justified. Rather, in my view, the right argument is that the state and the system we live under are responsible. High levels of violence are really a sign of a society in disrepair. And that's how we should make sense of racial disparities in incarceration and the twin racial disparities in crime. And this actually has very profound consequences for how we should think about the purpose and justification of punishment. I'm not going to say very much about that in the talk, but I'm very happy to discuss it in the Q&A. So those were 7 misconceptions. And in response, I've said 7 things to you. I've made 7 arguments. I've said that crime actually, in fact, did increase. Public fear of crime has responded to the crime rate. American criminal justice is actually exceptionally democratic, exceptionally in the sense of exceptional with respect to other countries, and that mass incarceration was built at the state and local level, not by key autocratic figures at the federal level. 4th, it is not about the war on drugs. 5th, mass incarceration and policing have probably had some negative depressive effect on crime. 6th, mass incarceration is not expensive, but actually a remarkably cheap way of managing social disorder. And 7th, racial disparities are mostly in large part the result of antecedent racial inequality rather than differential treatment inside the criminal justice system. These, in my view, are 7 things that answers to those big puzzles that I outlined at the beginning have to take seriously. So having noted them, I'm now in a place to offer my own brief account of the 3 puzzles at the outset. So first, the puzzle was, why did incarceration rates rise? What changed in the 1970s in the United States? Well, as I've said already, crime and violence rose to remarkably high levels by international standards, by any comparable country. The United States had a homicide rate an order of magnitude higher than other developed countries. And I can say much more about why this happened in the Q&A if you're curious. You'll find an account of it in the Catalyst piece that Bhaskar referenced. The short of it is that America's development path produced unique and extensive social problems in labor markets in America's urban centers. As a consequence of this rise in violence, the American public reacted with alarm, and both the Black and the white public reacted with alarm. They demanded that politicians do something about it. Now, it's very important to note for us as socialists, as social democrats, that the demands were not simply punitive. There is a lot of evidence that the public supported all of the above strategies to fight violence. Jobs and education, fighting crime at its roots were popular, as were prisons and police. A very good book on this subject is a book by James Forman Jr. called Locking Up Our Own. But these demands, these kind of all of the above demands, these were deformed by the realities of the political and economic system that we live in the United States. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, think back to what I argued earlier about the relative expense of a social democratic assault on the root causes of crime. If you buy my argument, fighting crime at its roots would have required a dramatic expansion of America's welfare state. It would have required taking from the rich to give to the poor. And despite it sometimes being mooted by federal politicians, like in the 1960s, this approach to social problems in the United States has basically consistently failed. Now, this is, as many of you will know and will come as no surprise, is because of long-running constraints in American politics, the absence of a powerful working class movement, the absence of a social democratic party. This has meant that state elites are free to avoid spending more, expanding the tax base and spending on the poor. So what explains the rise in mass incarceration, to summarize? Well, because throughout the 20th century, there was no social democratic constituency in American politics to win the massive redistribution that could have averted the rise in crime before it happened or addressed it after it happened with a suite of social democratic policies. That's the first puzzle, why mass incarceration rose. What is the answer to the second puzzle? What explains American exceptionalism? Why does America have mass incarceration but not other countries? Well, the short version of this follows naturally from the first answer. America has mass incarceration because America is the only country in the advanced world without a social democratic party. The puzzle of American mass incarceration runs through the puzzle of no American socialism. Finally, third, what explains interracial disparities in mass incarceration and punishment? Well, as I argued to you, African Americans are overrepresented in American prisons because they're overrepresented in the ranks of the oppressed in the United States. So these are my answers to the 3 puzzles that I find at the beginning. Let me close now with lessons for reformers. What does all of this mean for us, for those of us who want to transform, dismantle American mass incarceration? Let me leave you with 5 things to think about, 5 things to think about as criminal justice reformers. First, ending mass incarceration requires an expansion of social policy, not just a reform of penal policy. Yes, of course, we should have shorter sentences. We should have easier conditions of parole. We should have humane conditions of confinement, reforms of policing. The list goes on and on and on. But a criminal justice reform is extremely important. But the overdevelopment of American penal policy is a consequence of the underdevelopment of social policy. And so to end mass incarceration, we must win social policy from the rich. We must win social democracy. That's the first and maybe the most important point. Second, ending mass incarceration is going to be expensive, not cheap. You know, you hear from time to time these days that the right is alarmed also about mass incarceration. And so sometimes the specter of a kind of left-right alliance is mooted in criminal justice circles. These alliances, if I'm right, are not going to go very far at all. And that's for two reasons. The first reason is, as I hope I've convinced you already, the need of the hour is to win expansive and expensive social policy. Good luck convincing Grover Norquist of this. The second point is that humane criminal justice policy is going to be much more expensive per capita than American criminal justice policy. The American right is alarmed that we spend $40,000 per capita on American prisoners, but a better system would actually spend much more. The left should not be alarmed by this. The Scandinavian system spends much more per capita on its prisoners than does the American system. Third point, criminal justice reform is not about reforming how we treat people who haven't done awful things. It is mostly about reforming how we treat people who have. Most people in prison have done things that require some kind of state intervention, state assistance in their lives. Hands-off policy is not a credible solution to their plight. So our grievance should not be that the state is intervening in their life, the fact of state intervention, but that it is intervening punitively after having neglected, indeed oppressed them for so long, and that it is intervening to punish without any eye to rehabilitation. Fourth, the left has to have something to say about crime and violence and its victims. The reality in the United States is that interpersonal violence is a very serious problem. Mass incarceration is a partly distorted reflection of this fact, as I've argued to you already. This remains true today, even though violent crime has declined so dramatically in the United States. By homicide rate today, the most violent city in the United States, I think, is St. Louis, Missouri. And it's today something like the 15th most violent city in the world, which is a remarkable fact for one of the richest countries in world history. St. Louis, Missouri is more violent than San Salvador, more violent than Kingston, Jamaica. So we're right to indict the punitive arms of the state for being heavy-handed and oppressive, and they bear special responsibilities. There's no doubt about this. I don't want there to be any confusion about that. But we cannot forget, as reformers, as leftists, as socialists, that an African-American man is roughly 25 times more likely to be killed by a civilian than by a police officer. This is a major, major form of state failure as well. And the left in general has not had that much to say about this. And in my view, that's not good enough. We must be able to talk about and to those who are worried about crime. Finally, fifth, to end racial disparities, we must fight racial inequality outside the criminal justice system as well as inside it. The challenge of ending the severe barbaric inequalities of American criminal justice, of the American carceral state, they're much more profound than ending racism by criminal justice, racial bias, racial differential treatment by criminal justice actors, whether through various kinds of training or however you propose to do so, employment schemes, whatever. Those are all good things. I don't want to be confused about my view. Those are all good things. But the challenge is so much more profound. The challenge is about attacking racial inequality over the life course outside of the criminal justice system. And it's that profound challenge that we have to have in our sights at all times. So let me just close then today by reminding you of what I've argued. I suggested to you that mass incarceration amounts to three puzzles about American punishment. What changed? Why the United States? Why racial inequality? I argue that many of the things that you've heard about mass incarceration, and thus the answers that you yourself might have given to these questions, are wrong or at least partly incomplete. And I argued basically to you that mass incarceration, and this is an argument that's developed at much more length in the Catalyst piece, American mass incarceration is the way a country without the ability to redistribute from rich to poor reacts to its extensive social problems and the resulting violence. The overdevelopment of American penal policy is a symptom of the underdevelopment of American social policy. Now, let me just leave you with one final thought derivative of this last point. One of the reasons that socialists have a special place in the fight against American mass incarceration is because we're arguably uniquely alive to the injustices of the carceral state, arguably. In other words, our values oblige us to do criminal justice reform, to fight for the oppressed, the downtrodden, the criminal. This is kind of the spirit of that famous, beautiful Eugene Debs quote. While there is a soul in prison, I am not free. But there is another reason, in my view, that you as a socialist ought to commit to the fight for criminal justice reform. And it's not just that you as a socialist should commit to reform, to criminal justice campaigns, because you need this to be a true to your values socialist in in the America of 2020. It's because if you accept the argument that I've tried to make to you today, criminal justice reform urgently needs socialists. If criminal justice reform were the simple matter of retraining police officers, prosecutors, judges, ending the war on drugs, and redirecting some of the revenue from penal policy to social policy, it could arguably be left to liberals and to the political mainstream. But it is not. If I have convinced you of one thing today, please let it be this: criminal justice reform is actually the much more difficult, trenchant challenge of fighting American racial and class inequality at its root. And because it is this, it desperately needs us. It desperately, desperately needs you. Thanks very much.
All right. Well, thank you, Donna. You actually you told me 45 minutes, but you did just 35, which is good because most people tell me 35 or 25 and do 45.
I live to
So
please.
we do have time for a few questions. A couple have come in, but just a quick reminder to everyone. I know there's no need to really repeat it because you're watching a video and you could see the title of the video and you could see the Jacobin magazine. It's on our YouTube channel. But just press subscribe, press like. That's how we get the videos to more people. We have a lot of great material coming up. I don't really need to repeat it, but if you tune into the beginning of the video, you'll see that I ran down our schedule for the week, and it's all really good stuff. So I'm going to start with a question from Ben Taylor before maybe getting some more difficult ones, which is a lingering question that Ben had from the article. Do you think federal block LEAA block grants or federal block grants had anything to do with increasing demand for anti-crime measures, even if that demand was already largely present?
Interesting. Okay, so my sense of the facts of the matter are that those came basically too late in this game to be an explanation of the story of American mass incarceration. So if I'm not wrong, that's a story of the mid 1990s. That's kind of post 1994 crime bill. And by then, really, much of the machinery of the American carceral state had already been built. So that's really actually one of the reasons that I think this is mainly a story of what state and local governments are doing. Certainly, those block grants and other federal policies had the effect of exacerbating some of these trends. But the way to think about this is in a counterfactual world in which the administrations at the federal level had really not done all that much, would America have looked very different? And my wager to you is that probably not.
So one additional question that came up, and I guess David Kalnitsky also asked it, but I know you kind of phrased it in such a way that it was begging for a follow-up during the Q&A, which is the question of democracy and criminal justice policy. So David asked, should criminal justice policy be less democratic then, following for what you were saying? So let's talk about democracy and criminal justice. Should we have, let's say, no elected judges and an expanded civil service of some type? What are the conclusions that flow from what you mentioned?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. I've thought a lot about this without necessarily having a great answer. My inclination is that all of us agree, all socialists agree, that people have certain elementary basic rights that can't be contravened by whatever other people believe about those rights. And a lot of the things that are owed to people in the course of the criminal justice process have the appearance of basically those kinds of rights. So, for instance, I think most socialists are committed to the idea that we should not have a death penalty in the United States. Now, for a long time in American public opinion, majorities of the population have agreed that a death penalty is legitimate. They've supported the death penalty. Now, in that case, it seems clear to me that our principles oblige us to defend the abolition of the death penalty against popular opinion. And I think that actually that kind of tension surfaces a lot in the course of criminal justice. What I will say is that one of the reasons, this is what I alluded to when I was when I was making the point about democracy, is that one of the reasons that I think I have some hesitation about making that argument in full is because I think so much of the deformities of the democracy that you observe in American criminal justice are a consequence of the limited options that are given to people in the American political system. But my short answer is that even in a world in which people had those many options, I think in many cases we would want to defend people's rights against popular opinion for sure. So specific policies like the election of judges, we can talk more about that, but the general tension is one that I think is very real and that socialists should think about.
Should we have doubts about trial by jury? Certain of its
Well, to
outcomes?
be honest, trial by jury is basically not a thing in the United States, right? I mean, most cases are actually settled out of court, so it's wrong. That's why I kind of hesitated when I mentioned jury trials, because they're not actually they make for great TV, but they're not really a big part of the American criminal justice system. But yeah, it's something to it's certainly something to think about. I mean, when you think about somebody who is guilty of doing something awful to somebody else, and you're approaching how they ought to be handled, I think we should think about it in much more of a public health mode, right? And a public health mode doesn't really have room for much popular input. Now, there are a lot of other issues that get raised by this, like what are the state's obligations to victims in addition to offenders? My view is that the state's obligations to victims should basically be discharged separately. So the state has obligations to the offender, which should take the form of thoughtful rehabilitative criminal justice policy, and the state's obligations to the victims should take the form of the health apparatus, the mental health apparatus, and the health apparatus. But
Yeah, I mean
that's
that gets
go
into
ahead.
one of the things we got into with Esther Taylor last night, which is kind of about the potential tensions between um, democracy and expertise, which has always been something the left has
Absolutely.
been, grappling with and trying to figure out the exact bounds. But sometimes we take, let's say, even someone mentioning the tyranny of the majority to just be some sort of anti-democratic right-wing talking point, we can maybe ignore the fact that there are certain individual rights and autonomies that we don't want, even an empowered democratic socialist majority, dictating on.
Absolutely. I mean, let me put it a little bit more provocatively, maybe, which is that democracy is a means to an end. It's a means, the end of socialism is really maximizing and maximally distributing in an egalitarian way freedom. And so democracy is often a means to that end, but it can sometimes interfere with that end. And in cases where it interferes with that end, we favor freedom over democracy.
So there's a question from Paul, which is I've seen literature about the use of prison labor taking away jobs that could be done for a higher wage. Is this a significant dynamic that the labor movement should be taking more seriously?
Interesting. So the evidence that I have seen on the kind of work that happens inside prisons is that it is not, basically in large part, the vast majority of jobs are not the kind of work that takes away jobs from the labor market in which the prison is situated. So the vast majority of prisoners who work, and I can't off the top of my head remember the figures, but the vast majority of prisoners who work in American prisons do work for the upkeep of that prison. And so you could maybe make the argument that they're taking jobs from contractor, but really the vast majority of people are doing sort of the task of just reproducing the prison from day to day. They're not the most people are not doing the kind of work that is often talked about when we talk about prison labor. And incidentally, this is another reason why I think the argument that you'll sometimes hear, which is that the prison industrial complex exists to further the exploitation of a low wage workforce, I think it doesn't really work, because actually one of the persistent grievances that prisoners have is not their over exploitation, but actually the absence of work opportunities at prisons. And of course, I think we should argue that they ought to be paid much better as well. That's an important part of the demands. But I think the provision of work is actually, there's an undersupply of work rather than oversupply of work at prisons, if that makes sense. Right. Bhaskar, I think you're muted.
All right. So I've been my computer is kind of very poor, so it just froze up for a while, and I've been cursing the entire time that I've been frozen. So hopefully I was muted for most of that. If not, then we'll edit it afterwards or something like that. But in any case, I guess someone mentioned the model of Iceland in the chat. So I was just wondering whether you could briefly, I know you didn't really prepare exactly on this, but talk about the actually existing model in certain Scandinavian states, if not Iceland, then Finland's one often cited or whatnot, to give us an
Sure.
example of what a near-term solution or better, better model would be, short of our fully socialist model. And then after that, I want to ask you a more provocative question about what this horizon of our aspiration should be.
Sure. I think it's a great question. I am unfortunately probably just going to repeat some of the things that I have said because I'm not an expert on the Icelandic criminal justice system or even the Nordics more generally. My view is that the kind of thing that they do very effectively is the sort of thing that I was trying to outline, which is that first, they fight social disorder with social policy, not with penal policy. The primary way in which the Nordics preemptively address social problems and post-emptively, or whatever the word would be, address the symptoms of social problems is through social policy. So that involves both kind of active anti-poverty, anti-segregation type of programs. You could imagine the analogs in the United States, but then also job opportunities, work opportunities for people who end up committing crime and going through prisons. But then the other thing, and I guess this is connected to the second thing that I just mentioned, is humane criminal justice policy, right? I mean, a Nordic prison looks nothing like an American prison. Partly it's about opportunities that people have to work and sort of reintegrate, if you will, although some people don't like that word, at prisons. So it's a combination of aggressive social policy and humane criminal justice policy oriented towards rehabilitation and reintegration rather than punitiveness.
So, can I get you to comment on one of the more provocative debates on the left right now, which is the question of abolition, but not necessarily just as the end goal, but even also as a rhetorical framing. So, for example, I encounter a lot of people through DSA or through other organizing or kind of on campuses and things like that who have a vision of are fighting for great immediate criminal justice reforms and even have a vision of what a, let's say, justice system under socialism or social democracy would look like in the future that's actually quite nuanced and complex, but they're committed to using the framework of abolition. And there's multiple reasons given. One of them is just, the system is just so ridiculously oppressive today. It's grown to such gargantuan heights that if there's not people out there calling for it all to be torn down, then what's chance do we have of any reform? Like often you get retorts like that.
Mm-hmm.
So I've not softened, but I've when I actually encounter people doing this activism or whatnot, they actually present a view of the world and the change they want, which is more complex than the caricature version of the argument. But I wanted to know where you stood on that, and kind of as you've seen this discourse of abolition evolve from just the fringes of the left to a much more mainstream position now.
Absolutely, it's a great question, and I agree with so much of what you've said that it deserves to be taken as a serious argument. So I would separate the two parts of the abolitionist argument as you yourself did, which is first a normative vision of what criminal justice should look like what is the world that we envision getting to. That's the first question, and then the second question is the tactical strategic question about whether or not it makes sense to use the language in our campaigns. So with regards to the first question, sometimes I feel like this is just a word game. In my view, we are not in the foreseeable future, maybe even in the full communist future, we're not going to be living in a world where we don't have organized, institutionalized forms of criminal justice. It's just not. I don't see that. I don't understand that even as a vision. I think we will always have forms of antisocial behavior, and so we will always need the sorts of institutions that do the kinds of things that prisons and police do. Whether you want to call them prisons or police or not, I don't think it's that important. So I think I have a difference of vision, maybe sometimes when I speak to an abolitionist who argues that, no, actually, I'm calling for the total abolition of these institutions. And sometimes I think maybe we're just using different words to describe the same thing. I think the more serious, important disagreement is the political disagreement about what use is the term in the campaigns that we run. My own worry, and this is a worry born of spending a lot of time looking at the public opinion of the American public around issues of criminal justice reform, is that by using the term abolitionism, we commit ourselves to being radically out of step with the American public. And I find this is probably not a position that I had 5 years ago, before I started looking at these data in detail. But there are some very, very sobering things that you see about Americans' attitudes towards these institutions when you look at these public opinion polls. And certainly, I think this is my own view about what it means to be a socialist in a society such as ours. Your job is not to be 10 steps ahead of public opinion. Your job is to be 2 steps or 3 steps, whatever the appropriate number of steps is, ahead of public opinion.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the lessons of all sorts of socialist organizing. You can't either, the old kind of Leninist language, you can't tail the masses, but you also can't, sprint so far ahead that you're just, in complete sectarian isolation. Um,
Precisely.
so I think that's a pretty good place to end it. You covered a lot of ground, but it was up. Someone in the comments mentioned this is probably the best organized talk that's been given so
Numbered
far.
lists, bro. It's all about numbered lists.
It's all about numbered lists. You took on a big topic, but for those who really want to get more into this, there's a long Catalyst essay out with Adaner and John. That's unpaywalled. We have a link to it. So please do read it, debate it, circulate it around. Adaner also did a long interview building on some of this in Jacobin. There's an interview out from John Clegg that should be out in Tribune in the next few days if it's not already out. His co-author, and they both take different parts of their argument in the interviews, and it's really worth a serious interrogation. And obviously also look at the footnotes. I mean, this is a topic where there's been a lot of literature recently. Adaner is critical of some of it, but I think does a really good job introducing what the authors are arguing. And also, there's a lot of other great material out too. So please do check out the Catalyst piece. If you're so taken, subscribe to Catalyst, subscribe to Jacobin. But in the meantime, the non-monetary ask is press like, press subscribe. And please tune in tomorrow at 6 p.m. when we have Marcus Barnett to talk about the socialism of Tony Benn, one of our favorite class traders. And well, thank you, Adaner. And I
Thanks very much.
see you once this hell is over. We just found out we're basically a mile away from each other, but it feels much, much, much further.
Much more distance. Yeah.
Take care.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you.